Welcome back to the Papers Podcast. This is Linda, and I have here with me today Lara.
Hi, everybody.
Jason.
I'm a little under the weather, everybody. Pardon my foghorn voice. Oh, it's foghorn voice. Sorry.
Yeah, but that's okay.
You know, you don't want to be mean to frogs here. And John.
And John.
John.
Wah, wah, wah. Hi, Linda. I'm doing great. How are you?
I have to say that you can't see John, but he has this growth on his upper lip, and a little bit on his lower lip that I think is supposed to be a mustache, but I'm not sure.
It's disturbing.
However, before
it's really not okay.
Well, just so people get a picture of it, this is a fundraiser. I was kind of bullied, but kind of encouraged by nurses at the hospital I work with to do this fundraiser. And I am channeling my primary school vice principal in it. So it is, if you can imagine the worst version of that, that's exactly what I look like right now.
So, John, rumor has it that you have an interesting paper. We'll see.
Dun, dun, dun. And John and his paper. So I've entitled this, I heard it on a podcast, Best Practices for Developing Quality Open Access Education Resources. And I get the irony here. It says irony. I always use the word irony wrong, which is maybe ironic. We're on a podcast, and now we're going to talk about best practices, and maybe we will, and maybe we won't learn something. So why did I choose this paper? And I'm already getting the antibodies from some of my hosts. And I think it's a function of, more often than not, I break into that tired, grumpy old man sitting on his porch back in my day. How come kids and their fancy new technologies? And if you talk to me about generative AI one more time, et cetera, don't you know how to read a good old textbook? Something like that. But I've been reflecting a little bit about what are the educational technologies that accompanied me through my training, and what am I using now, and what do I talk to some of my students that they have no idea ever existed. And so one of the best illustrations of reflecting on the rationale for this paper was when I was studying for my Royal College exams, I was using the most cutting educational technology of the time, which was the compact disc. So I had a portable compact disc player because I was that cool. Imagine like The Rock with the turtleneck and the fanny pack and the chain, all of that minus the muscles. That was me in the late 90s. Listening to CDs on one topic while I was going through a coffee table sized atlas of dermatology simultaneously. So I was trying to be super efficient. Now, whatever Meyer says about visual and oral learning at using parallel tracks and working memory, it does not work when there's two different topics. And so basically I was just generally psychotic. And I thought I was trying to be efficient. I was trying to hack my way to better efficiency. And that was my version. I'm curious to hear, Lara, Linda, Jason, what were your favorite technologies back in the day? Or what's your favorite technology right now? I'd like to see how you're trying to hack your own learning.
So my favorite technology back in the day was, I remember when I was in elementary school, my parents bought me a brand new cassette deck that had the two cassette decks. Anyway, and I recorded all of I read into one of the tapes the material on planets because we were studying solar system and whatever. And there was no way I was going to remember any of this. And I decided that if I played it while I was sleeping, that I would miraculously learn it. I passed the test. I don't think it has anything to do with miraculously learning it while sleeping. That was just probably because I read it to myself twice, like once to write it up and once to read it.
Lava, we must be siblings because I love that story. I also think you probably could make a mean mixtape. I think that might be the case too. With your dual,
right off the radio, right? Because remember they were on the radio.
Yeah,
you had to hit it just at the right moment. I can do that. Yeah.
So first of all, John, I must tell you that I grew up in a pre-technology age. I mean, we were probably chiseling something into the caves or in terms of learning. But I do remember as part of my master's, I wanted to take a class that was an in-person class. And this was way before the internet. And so they weren't too keen on it, but I said, come on, you're supposed to be innovative. And so they said, okay, you can take the class. You'll do all the readings. We will record our classes on 8-track tapes and send them to you. And then I had to send back my papers and other assignments by fax. So that was the high tech when I was but a child.
Oh my God.
Is it telling that healthcare still uses a fax, but you can't find an 8-track for your life view in the last 40 years? All right, JF, what do you got?
All right, I'll add super nerdy to nerdy. So I, in residency, loved listening to audio, and that only came in like cassette tapes. So I listened to, EMA abstracts, which is emergency medicine abstracts, on cassette tapes. And to be extra nerdy on this podcast, I listened to lectures from the AAMC on cassette tapes. I ordered them. They came in. I learned med ed that way because I couldn't afford flights to the actual meeting. So there you go. Ancient tech.
So it's interesting in our youth, because these are all stories from back in the day. Not only have you talked about contemporary use of technology, but back in the day, we were all perhaps early adopters using technology, but then we froze. And so
no, I can give you an idea of like recently. You said one or the other. So I thought that was a cuter story.
I'm making a straw dog argument to justify my paper.
Totally going to light that thing on fire.
I think what we're seeing though is open education resources have really boomed in the last decade. And when we talk about open education resources, we're typically talking about something that's digital on the internet with low, if not no cost to produce and no cost for the consumer to use. Often distributed via various digital platforms where you can redistribute it, adapt it, or share it in whatever way that you feel like. And it's this low barrier to production that has led to this, I would say, maybe a bit of a democratization of how we produce education resources. If you want to be a textbook author, you need to be famous, you need to be connected, you need to have certain issues of power. And open education resources potentially have reduced some of that. But there's a lot of challenges. And
John?
This is where I feel a little bit about Homer slipping back into the hedge of saying we should probably be careful because we're on a podcast. Lara, Linda, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so would you consider open education resources as open access journal articles, for instance? Those that you're either not paying for or that the authors haven't paid for?
I guess it all depends on how you want to define it. So the IP of those open access are not for redistribution. It's for the sole user and not for adaption. So when we're talking open education, I think we're talking about things where there's a Creative Commons license for their use. I think most people would probably look at an open access resource not following that typical category. So I think we have to be careful, though. Just because we can get at things doesn't mean they are the things we should get. And so that is the potential critique of these OERs, which are, how do we know what the quality? How do we know about the comprehensiveness? What is the process for renewal to keep things current? And other issues certainly threaten these use of resources exclusively. And these threats are not unique to OERs and could be easily leveled against textbooks and other types of traditional resources that we use. So can we learn about best practices for the do's, don'ts, and perhaps even don't knows about how we should produce open educational resources? With that, enter Khalid et al. And this is a paper by Khalid et al. With friends of the show, Brent Thoma, Yusuf Yilmaz, Youngmin Kim, and Teresa Chan. The title is Guidelines, the Do's, Don'ts, and Don't Knows of Creating Open Education Resources, published in PME this year, and it is available open access. So there's a bit of a twist on open access and open education resources.
So meta.
Here's what they did. They conducted a rapid review involving 4 steps. They got the citations from a previous publication on how to evaluate OERs. The authorship team then added some additional references. Then they did a quick search from 2010 to 2020 of Medline, Embase, and Cochrane using only 2 keywords. They weren't mesh terms, but they were just keywords. And then they did a hand search of the reference list of all included studies. A bit of hand waving happens next because they identify key take-home points and curate and aggregated it into a list of recommendations, and then they apply the PME framework to grade the guidelines. We're going to talk about the guidelines just in a second, but I'm going to turn to Jason, Lara, Linda to comment on the methods. Before we debate the ideas, are the ideas worthy of debate?
Okay, so I struggled with the methods of this paper, and I hope you guys can help me with this. And I want to be open-minded. Our friends are our authors on this one. Youngmin Kim just took me out for lunch last week, so I got to be really nice. Having said that, the search obviously was truncated. I get the rapid nature of the review, but it makes me wonder about what was missed. And then there's kind of like this black box where, magic happened and themes emerged, and suddenly there's a list. And I thought the list was, we're going to do the results in a sec. I thought the list was going to be focused on how you make a quality, because that's the setup, a quality product. But the list ends up being quite a variety of different things. And so maybe you can help me with the methods, guys, because I didn't see this coming.
So this is a tricky paper, right? Because it's not a traditional lit review. And it's not a research manuscript. What they're doing is they're generating guidelines. And so often when we generate guidelines, we do some kind of consensus method. And I think actually you could probably say that this is a bit of a consensus approach where the author team is the expert group generating the consensus. And I think that there are a number of experts on their team. So you could say it drew inspiration, for instance, from something like a nominal group technique, because in that kind of consensus building approach, you start with materials and then you organize and you rank order and all those sorts of things. So it's tricky because it doesn't really follow a specified methodology, but I'm not sure there is necessarily one for generating guidelines. So it works for me. There is a part where part didn't work for me. And it looked at, one of the things they talked about is that they looked at other guideline papers, or they used a ranking system that has been used in other guideline papers by this journal, and they didn't give it in our paper. So I pulled up the papers they cited and found the table that describes the criteria for strength recommendations, right? Because part of their ranking system is that there's strong, moderate, or tentative empirical evidence and consensus among the team. So I pulled that up, and it's the description of these criteria are quite short, and we can share that with you. I pulled it from the article of the do's, don'ts, and don't know about remediation. That's where I found the table. All that to say, the methods approach that they used is a little hard to adjudicate or to be able to comment on rigor, because in generating guideline, there's a little more elbow room in that space than there is in a traditional research study. So, yeah, that's my very formal quantification of how I feel.
Is that another way of saying I don't know what they did?
No, I know what they did. I'm just not sure I'm going to critique it in a really strong way because there are no real criteria.
I think in general, I know what they did. I had a quibble, as well as what we've just talked about, with one of the phrases they used. I think they said they crowdsourced additional studies from the authorship team. And I'm wondering, can you actually crowdsource from within yourself, from your own team? It seems to me that that's a bit odd. Maybe they should just have used another term rather than crowdsource.
I think all those comments are fair. The reason I never use the word crowdsource from the manuscript because I don't think it was crowdsourcing. I do think that if we were going to do a reliability of us as hosts and went back to other kind of innovations, I'm thinking back to our lexicon paper and how we generated the consensus around there, and a whole bunch of group consensus types of scholarly outputs. We're inconsistent with how hard or with how liberal we are with the method section. I think we just need to flag it for the reader and decide, all right, here's some recommendations. They've tried to synthesize the literature in some way and make some recommendations. Is this sufficient for you? And are the stakes high enough for you when you decide you want to produce a blog or some kind of podcast? I think that's the threshold test, at least for me. Let's move to the results. They had 81 articles that were kind of the source material for the recommendations. And if you are not regularly going to the paperspodcast.com site, see what I'm doing there, some guerrilla marketing. You can find our abstract where I've pulled this table as part of the results section for the abstract for this episode. And I'm kind of hoping, as I wring my hands slightly nervously, that I can reproduce that table because it's a open access paper on open education resources. So I figure there's enough momentum there that you can see the original paper without me reproducing it in some way. They have 15 recommendations. And in a second, I'm going to ask the host to comment on a recommendation that they thought was meaningful to them. I want to flag the two that they had a large endorsement for. And they said that because they thought the recommendations were supported by enough evidence in the literature to say, you know what, you really should think about this. And so these were the two recommendations. You should contribute to a virtual community of practice of educators who are creating your OER. I think said another way is, if you have a team that's collectively working on your open education resource, the near-peer quality standard probably takes into effect. The longitudinal nature and the volume of products that you produce probably ensures that it's more than a one-hit wonder. And certainly the different perspectives probably give it a richer take and a more nuanced contribution style to what's producing. And so don't be a solo act, play in a band, I think is the punchline there. The other one they think that has a strong support from literature is to use infographics and graphical abstracts to present your information. And they suggest a number of rationales for this, but that certainly in these digital forums, pictures seem to be a really important way to aggregate and represent the information that you're trying to produce. I'll flag for you a couple areas where they're not really sure what's going on. And it might be a source for education scholars that are looking for their own kind of investigation or their own kind of work. And essentially what is unknown about what you should do if you're producing an OER is, what does it look like if you're not from a Western English speaking point of view? Because the literature is not well represented outside of the West and outside of an English language presentation of resources. What are the best types and best practices to optimize learning? That literature is very unclear. Just because it's new and shiny doesn't mean it works. How do we integrate these open access resources into our existing curricula? Do they supplant them? Are they integrative? Are they additional and kind of an appendix model? Where do they all fit? Nobody has an answer to that. And what's the ethics around industry support for some of these resources, and how should that be demarcated? And let's imagine that this is a problem that the peer-reviewed literature experienced in a significant way in the 80s and 90s, before we realized that industry should be driving the outputs and the practice of clinicians. So Linda, Jason, Lara, what were a recommendation that you really thought was right on the mark or that you took issue with?
So I thought recommendation 8 was relevant. It's create and use podcasts as learning resources, knowing that trainees may be concurrently dual tasking. So moderate recommendation. I think what they're saying is remember that people can walk and chew gum at the same time. We're going to do an upcoming article talking about multitasking where it's sort of shown that students who multitask in lectures may get lower grades and have decreased attention in the lectures. Now, they actually give an interesting reason for it. Cognitive bottlenecking. So it's been looked at in lectures. The idea being that it's very hard if you're doing as you did with your dermatology and your audio tapes. Try to do two things with two different contents at the same time. So just remember, it's fine if you're walking or driving to work, but if you're actually trying to study, probably not.
I just want to do a little shout out to Yasmin Jabari and Mike Gottlieb. We never do our own paper, so the Papers Podcast audience won't know that we've published a couple papers on listening to podcasts while driving, and we've used a high fidelity simulator. And we found that, you can do multitasking, which is the automation of driving, even in novel and high in density environments, and still learn quite effectively when you're listening to podcasts. So shout out to Yasmin and Mike for that work.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that you can, learn how to do a medical skill and do something else medical at the same time.
Oh no, you should see how my Royal College exam went. Not well.
John, while you got your mic on, can you just clarify for me, are all the items in this guideline, the do's and don'ts, are they all generated as themes out of their lit review, or are some of them from the 9 authors as well? I wasn't clear from reading it.
I think it's the final aggregation of the lit review, the initial citations, the additional citations offered by the authors, and then the additional rapid review. So they took all of that data. They found the articles that were relevant. There were a few articles that were very specialized about how to do open education resources on point of care ultrasound, for example, was not generalizable to the main field. And so their results come from that data. That's what is the source material for their guidelines.
I was really struck by this list being very heterogeneous. I mean, the one that seemed solid to me that was actually useful to make a product better, like the first one, just do a needs assessment. That's old school, but it seems to me that would influence quality more than many of the others on this list, which we're going to talk about in a bit.
So then I'll highlight number 3 and maybe number 4 too. So number 3 worked for me. Use critical appraisals and tools to guide creation. I have a bit of a challenge when it comes to critical guidelines and those sorts of things, and thou shalt do X, Y, and Z, because checklists are distillations of distillations that are decontextualized. And so there's something to them in the sense that they can provide you a checklist or a list of things to think about and to consider. But I think we just need to be a little bit thoughtful in how we apply them. And given, for instance, that the list of different kinds of OERs that they're talking about in this guideline, they're so incredibly diverse that I do like the guidelines or checklist for podcasts is not going to be the same for a wiki, right? So I think we just have to be a little bit thoughtful there.
I think your point's correct. I don't think they ever, however, I wouldn't say that they presented it as a checklist. I mean, if that's the case, then the next time we look at a scoping review, we can't say, hey, did you do the 5 elements of an Arksy O'Malley recommendation, right? So, I think they represent them more as these are the principles.
Yeah, so I wasn't talking about their list as a checklist of things to do. I was talking about, so item 3 says use critical appraisals and tools to guide creation. And my point is that those tools are ish. They're things to consider.
Yeah, these authors have also done a whole lot of checklists and quality checklists around what's good quality and what's good content. And so there might be a little bit of a unconscious bias seeping in there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I guess the answer to the audience is you should take a look at the tables and find what are areas that you weren't considering as you thought about building your wiki, or you thought about having an infographic series, or you thought about doing a blog, or whatever it is you're going to be doing that might help inform and improve the experience, both for you as a creator and for your audience as a consumer. Here's how the authors conclude their paper. I'm going to quote them. This article culminates key evidence into... Let me just start speaking English again and take 2. This article culminates key evidence into a guideline for the creation of OERs. We hope that the field will continue to evolve its practices by addressing the don't knows, bringing further clarity to the do's and don'ts of the field. Before I go to a round of votes, just a quick paperclip from me, which is, this is the first time we've talked about a rapid review. It's a type of synthesis that's really kind of a subdomain of a systematic review, where you kind of streamline. Oh, I see some consternation from Lara. We'll get to you in a second. But you streamline or you omit specific steps in the traditional systematic review methodologies. So you shorten your search, or you do a limited quality assessment. And you see this a lot in biomedical type research, where there is a stale datedness to the data. And we saw this all the time during COVID, where every couple months you got a very rapid review of some kind of treatment management guideline. I'm a little kind of perplexed as to why they needed to do a rapid review for this topic. It's not like, pods and blogs are going anywhere, and why they couldn't done a more fulsome review. That's a design choice for those authors. I'm trying to think of an example that we might see in HPE. Maybe it's the changing nature of generative AI. And so maybe we need a rapid review on ChatGPT because the world's going to change every 6 months as we move. But I think a rapid review would not be a typical type of synthesis we do in Meta. Go ahead, Lara.
They didn't do a rapid review. What they did is they used the literature. And so I'm drawing from their I'm going to read you a line from their article. The literature review was conducted using a combination of the results from a rapid review of OER evaluations by Ting et al., a hand search of all references from the articles from the Ting et al. Review, and expert feedback from our guidelines senior authors who are well published in this area. So I hear what you're saying about rapid reviews. I agree with your point in as a whole. They didn't do a rapid review, though.
I disagree. Their search was a 10-year search of three databases without any true quality assessment. That's what they do. And then they try to synthesize it. I think they did a version of a rapid review.
Agree to disagree.
Maybe we need to have a definition of rapid reviews so we know why we're getting a difference of opinion here.
My definition is a rapid review is a subtype of a systematic review where you just shorten up your search criteria or you shorten your quality assessment.
You looking at me like you want me to say something?
No, I'm just that's how I define a rapid review.
So I've never done a rapid review myself, but if I go to Grant and Booth, who did a typology of different kinds of literature reviews.
You hate that reference.
I really do hate this reference. I can't believe you're going
to use this to endorse your argument.
No, I'm not going to use it to endorse anything, but she wants a definition, and this is what I can find quickly. So a rapid review, the description that they offer is assessment of what is already known about a policy or practice issue by using systematic literature reviews methods to search and critically appraise existing literature.
I don't know. It kind of supports John's position on this one.
I don't know.
There you go. It's the mustache.
Before we get too down this rabbit hole, let's go to our round of votes. There was one other paperclip I wanted to offer. Both the first and second author were medical students, so congratulations to them to getting a pub done.
Good for them.
I wonder if the rationale for them doing it is because the uptake, at least in my limited N of one experience, the uptake of educational resources of this type are really high amongst residents and medical students. And there is some literature that shows that that learners are not going to the primary peer-reviewed literature, they're going to the second-order reviews, which sometimes are great, but sometimes the quality control is really to be questioned.
Yeah.
More often than not, I hear someone say, well, I heard on a podcast. Hence, you see what I'm doing? The foreshadowing is coming back to the title of our episode. High five me.
No, that's not, I'm not putting my hand up for a high five. I want you to clarify something, John. Can you just comment on whether what's your opinion about the guideline content? Because I am struggling with, there's a recommendation about something. It's like an instructional design element. And then there's a recommendation then where there's something to contribute to a virtual community of other people making OERs. And it's kind of all over the place. Is this a guideline in your mind?
I think they're guidelines. I think what you're wrestling with is you don't like how they've arranged it. So I think they arranged it by the positive valence. You should do this versus don't do this, rather than here's the sequence you might go through in the production of a resource. Get yourself involved in a community and think about the ethics and all the authorship elements versus the process of do a needs assessment, follow these best practices for dissemination, etc.
Just thinking about an educational guideline, if this was a clinical guideline, it's a mix of, do make a diagnosis, do use this medication. Oh, and, join a specialty society. It's kind of a dog's breakfast of a list.
I'm not going to be as hard. I'll let you jump in a second, Lara. I'm not as critical, Ed. Every time I read an AHA guideline, so for the international audience, that's the American Heart Association, they'll tackle a topic and it will be usually 150 pages. So you have to read the executive summary, which is still 15 pages long. And they go through everything from agreements around epidemiology to the pathophysiology to emerging therapies, etc. And you really have to kind of scurry around to find anything that you might have of interest, but it's all over sometimes. The organizing feature is the disease state. Go ahead.
So what I'm going to say is that I think what this guideline does is reflect the literature. The literature about OERs is a really diverse sort of potpourri of topics because there's so many different kinds. And they sit under, like, OER is a huge umbrella. And so the things that fit underneath them are going to be really diverse because a lot of things fall under there. So for me, the fact that they have many different kinds of guidelines to offer, that to me is a reflection of the literature. That reflects the diversity of OERs. What I find challenging is the extent to which, like these guidelines, I think we have to be a little bit careful because only 2 of them are standing on strong evidence. The rest are moderate to tentative evidence, which then suggests to me that the 2 that had strong evidence were contribute to a virtual community of practice and develop infographics. So, which, to your point, Jason, are really dissimilar, sort of not necessarily speaking to the same sort of thing topics, but my concern is that there's not a lot of evidence. So we have to really take most of these guidelines as really ish for now.
And the evidence is in the author's opinion. Like it's 9 people's opinions about these things. I'm not sure how I'd use this.
I think you might be happier if they didn't use the word guidelines. I think if they delayed them in,
yes,
themes for production. I think using the word guidelines is probably a stronger.
Issues, scoping review, something different. But a guideline.
Well, John thinks it's a rapid review.
It was just tips. Yeah. All right. Why just not call this tips?
Yeah. Tips.
Okay.
Tips are going to slept better.
Angels dancing on the heads of pins, whether it's a rapid review or not, whether it's a guideline or whatnot. Let's move to the round of votes, the important part of the episode. For methods, I'm going to turn to Miss Mia. What was you were saying? I'm not even sure what to do. You're going to, we're getting the sound effect this week. Okay. All right. Oh, 1 to 5. Lara, Linda, Jason.
So I've decided that in honor of, so I really do feel, as our listeners know, I can't support this ranking system, this number game that we play at the end.
We've heard. Give us a number.
Yeah, I think I've heard that once or twice.
I can't do it because by doing that, I start to suggest that I uphold it, and I don't. So instead, what I've decided is that every episode, I'm going to pick a new form of currency, and I'm going to make my evaluation in that form of currency. And so since most Since most of these authors are Canadian, I'm going to go with Canadian currency. So I'm going to give it 2 toonies and a loonie.
Fair enough.
You give it 5 stars.
2.5.
That's this is why my system's gorge. Nobody knows.
You know what? We're just going to take away your right to vote,
That's
and
fine.
we're going to assign it to the 3 of us.
Who cares?
I actually meant 3.
Linda.
What I would like to do is use words rather than numbers. I'd like to go from to meh to
This is infectious.
wow,
Look
or
what you've
something
done,
like that.
Lava.
But,
you wrecked the team.
Wins come in all shapes and sizes. This is a win.
But gentlemen, I won't do that. I'll give it a 3. There were questions I had about the methods, and there were quibbles we had with the methods, but I think it was clear enough.
In my virus-laden state, I'm going to give this a 2. I had trouble following their logic and their rigor.
I've worked on the international liaison for the outcomes in resuscitation, ILCOR, if you know what that is, if you're into resuscitation work. And it spends millions of dollars and affects lots of stuff. And what they did here was equivalent to that. So I don't think we can fault them. And so I think us being too hard on them would say, hey, the whole guideline recommendations for how we manage cardiac arrest is predicated on the similar quality that's here. So I would have loved more details.
So maybe you want to take on those guidelines. I'm just saying. Maybe that's a thing.
No, I spent enough time in Dallas in my life. I don't need to ever go back, despite my mustache. So I'm going to give them a 3. I think it's right on track. I don't have any concerns. Would have liked some more details because otherwise I felt there was a bit of hand waving at the end of their method section. In terms of educational impact, let's do reverse order.
I'm not sure how I'd use this paper. I struggled with the list, and I'm really sorry to say that because I really like the authors, but so I'm going to give this a 2.
Jason, if only you knew someone who was producing an open educational resource. If only you yourself was producing one of those things. Maybe you could find some way to translate this into praxis.
That's just it. You just made my point. I can't.
Well, really, Jason. Okay. Again, I'm going to give this a 3. Why? Because I don't think there's that much new here that we're not already using. But on the other hand, when you look into some of the details of the descriptors of some of these, what they call guidelines, they've got some pretty good stuff. I actually looked at the one guideline about podcasts and surprise, surprise, had to think about what do we do with our podcast and does it mean anything? And in fact, just so you know, dear audience and listeners, we could apply all of what they suggest to our podcast. So it gets a 3.
So I'm going to now turn to the ever popular Canadian tire funny money system, and I'm going to give it 2 25-cent bills and a 10-cent bill.
That's a 3.
Just interpret it.
Well, it is because it's 60 cents, right?
60
Because
cents.
Yeah, I'm translating for the
It's a
numbers
2.5, actually.
Except the only problem is we need to put it back into American currency for her. So there's like a 30% decrease of that. So it's really a 2 because it's only worth 40 cents.
Ooh, yeah, that's fair. Yeah, that's a good exchange.
I'm going to give this a 4. And I'm going to do it from the perspective of creators. So you know what? It made me think, and I hope Teresa Sörö doesn't have a heart attack, but maybe rather than having a written abstract, we should just go to a visual abstract for our own episodes here on the Papers Podcast.
Is that like a visual episode like your mustache? Or
well, I guess that's the loser prize if anybody else open that. I was most struck by opening up areas where the literature is not clear. And I want to use a big fancy word just to make Lara proud. I had to look this one up. The hegemony of OERs from a Western perspective. There we go. Do you not see it? But I'm getting a heart emoji from Lara. I don't even know if I said that right.
No, it's hegemony, but that's fine. Go on. You're doing great.
Hegemony. Okay. All right. As usual, I mispronounce everything. It was thoughtful to me that we don't talk about what are the industry tie-ins and how do we speak explicitly about those connections. So there are conversations that educators need to have that I think this manuscript has identified. That's the stuff that I thought was value added for me. So that's a 4. Listeners, you're using open education resources by the very fact that you're here. We'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at thepaperspodcast@gmail.com. You can go find our written but not our visual abstract at paperspodcast.com.
However, before we allow John to have the microphone, I would like to read to you a comment that we got from a colleague of us all, Meredith Young. Meredith has gotten into the habit of listening to the Papers podcast on her walk to work. And she listened to our recent episode on research ethics, and it got her thinking about the important distinction that's traveled with her from her home discipline of cognitive psychology into her research practice in health professions education. What she wants to talk about is language that distinguishes between participants and subjects. Participants are those that can and are legally allowed to and legally protected by the need to provide consent. Participants are therefore those who have consented to participate in research. Subjects are those who do not, cannot, or do not have the legal protection of consent. Therefore, subjects don't provide consent, and this includes children, prisoners, enslaved people, and maybe for us, perhaps medical students, who knows? Anyway, it gets tricky because we use the term subject as a design feature, such as human subjects research or within subjects design. And because the design and the stats we use don't necessitate a consideration for consent, they are used for animal studies, rocks, minerals, bacteria, people, or whatever. But the necessity of consent moves people from subjects to participants. So Meredith wanted to share this with us because she wants to encourage us to be a little bit less slippery, as she put it, with these two terms. Consent is important, and denying the right and protection of consent holds some of the blame for some rather horrible things that have happened in the name of science when we thought of certain people as subjects that are done to rather than participants that are done with. So I talked to Meredith about this, and I said, but of course we always use the term participants, don't we? And she said, I listened, and sometimes we slip into subjects. So I guess, dear friends, this is a note for us all to be aware of and conscious of how we use words. So thanks, Meredith, for sending that on to us, and I'd like all of us. So now let's go back.
We'd love to hear what you think about this episode. We'd love to hear if you think we're using words incorrectly, because we all know that I can't pronounce most of them. We'd love to hear just your ideas about papers that you think would be really interesting for us to collectively consider as an HB community. With that, thanks for listening.
Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.
You've been listening to the Papers Podcast. We hope we made you just slightly smarter. The podcast is a production of the Unit for Teaching and Learning at the Karolinska Institutet. The executive producer today was my friend Teresa Sörö. The technical producer today was Samuel Lundberg. You can learn more about the Papers Podcast and contact us at www.thepaperspodcast.com. Thank you for listening, everybody, and thank you for all you do. Take care.